Hello. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Hammer Forum on the Corporatization and Commodification of Food with Frederick Kaufman and Wenonah Hauter, and moderated by Ian Masters. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues. It's made possible with the very generous support of Andy and Branya Galiff. So on to tonight's program. Our moderator is Ian Masters, who's going to introduce our guest speakers. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of the Daily Briefing every Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m., as well as Background Briefing on Sundays at 11 a.m., all on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and all of you for coming tonight for some intellectual nourishment, after which you may or may not lose your appetite for food. We sedentary couch potatoes were once hunters and gatherers who had to forage for food or die. We had to kill to live. And like most animals, feeding our offspring and ourselves was our main daily preoccupation. But times have changed, and now our food is killed and caught for us in abattoirs and by factory ships. And instead we hunt for bargains at supermarkets and gather groceries in an SUV. Meanwhile, our physical evolution over thousands of years lags behind the last 200 years of industrialization, corporatization, and commodification of food. As we still retain the bodies of ancient hunters and gatherers without having to do the work to get our food. That, according to the leading research being done on the obesity epidemic, combined with the ubiquitous use of high fructose corn syrup in just about everything we buy at the supermarket, has turned us into a nation of lumbering lumps of lard. Stuffed and starved, as Raj Patel called us, since about half of our population are both overweight while undernourished. So who is poisoning America? Who is killing off the population in genocidal proportions? Is it the Iranians, the North Koreans, Al-Qaeda? No, it's Monsanto, Archer Daniel Midland, Conagra, Cargill, Dow, and Tyson at one end, and McDonald's, Burger King, Domino Pizza, Coke, Pepsi, and Colonel Sanders at the other. Michael Moss, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his New York Times series on beef contamination, exposing the additive of pink slime that led to a discontinuation of its use by several companies, has a new book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us, in which he describes how the food industry has meticulously researched and orchestrated our cravings for food. In essence, the more sugar, salt, and fat you eat, the more the hedonistic part of your brain insists you want more. This cycle has contributed to our current and concurrent epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease that are driving up the already prohibitive cost of healthcare. The food giants know how to use our taste buds and our brain's reward centers, which they've systematically studied and manipulated, against us. And our government and the Department of Agriculture are co-conspirators in as much as the growing millions of Americans living in poverty who rely on food stamps have to feed their kids Wonder Bread and Coca-Cola to stretch their meager budgets, providing their children with the illusion of nourishment while shortening their lifespans. Moss opens his expose with a top-secret meeting in 1999 of the CEOs of some of the food industry's largest companies, Nestle, Kraft, Nabisco, General Mills, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, and Mars. An executive at Pillsbury, James Bainke, who convened the summit in an attempt to persuade his industry colleagues to look at their role in the growing obesity epidemic and to ease up on their aggressive marketing of high-calorie processed convenience food and sugared beverages. The proposal put forth at this meeting was for an industry-wide code to tone down advertising, especially to children, and to lead a national campaign promoting exercise. By playing the good guys and regulating themselves, these companies could deflect growing public criticism of the sugary cereals marketed to children and head off the possibility of government regulation. But within minutes of the start of the meeting, it became clear that the competitive desires of the participants for ever greater revenues trumped worries over the health dangers of America's expanding waistline. In the end, the Pillsbury executive's tentative intervention fell flatter than what was left of the supersized soda Sarah Palin was seen sipping to show Mayor Bloomberg how real Americans feel about him trying to take away their right to be a profit center for big corporations. The top dogs at Big Food ignored the advice from the Pillsbury executive and doubled down, piling on the high fructose corn syrup while plastering labels on their products pronouncing less sugar, less fat, less salt, as the food giants returned to business as usual. So much for corporatization. On the other aspect of tonight's talk, the commodification of food, although commodification may not be an official word, it sounds better than commoditization. But without jumping the gun, let me just say that the New York Times recently provided a clue to what is going on and why our farmers are getting screwed while the consumer is getting fleeced. The Times showed in their recent expose how Goldman Sachs had cornered the market on aluminum ingots that they drove around in a shell game from warehouse to warehouse to drive up the price in order to make a killing on commodities and futures trades known on Wall Street as the Goldman Sachs Index. Ironically, in recent Senate testimony during an investigation of Wall Street's gaming of aluminum ingots, the executives from Coca-Cola claimed they were the injured party at the hearing because they are getting gouged on the price of aluminum cans. So there you have it in a nutshell. They screw you on the outside while they kill you slowly on the inside. Wenonah Hauter will speak first for about 15 minutes, followed by Frederick Kaufman, and then we'll have a discussion before extensive Q&A with you, our audience. Wenonah Hauter is Executive Director of Food and Water Watch, where she has worked extensively on energy, food, water, and environmental issues at the national, state, and local level. From 1997 to 2005, she served as Director of Public Citizens Energy and Environment Program, which focused on water, food, and energy policy. From 1996 to 1997, she was Environmental Policy Director for Citizen Action, and from 1989 to 1995, she was Senior Organizer at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's the author of Foodopoly, The Battle Over the Future of Food and Farming in America, which she will be signing after the event in the foyer upstairs. A representative of that endangered species, the family farmer. Ladies and gentlemen, Wenonah Hauter.
It's terrific to be here tonight, and we're going to start with a short trailer about the Foodopoly. So I want to take a few minutes tonight to do the 10-minute crib notes of how we ended up with a Foodopoly, because you need to know where you've been to know where you're going. Now, the story really begins back in the 1920s when we had the bad behavior of the financial services industry, similarly to what just happened. Now, the Roosevelt administration came into office with the New Deal, and they decided to do something to help the farmers who had been devastated in the 1920s when we lost 1 out of 4 farms. So they instituted some common sense policies like a grain reserve, taking marginal land out of production, and having a price floor so it was that farmers could actually make a living farming. Now, these policies worked really well through World War II when the U.S. really was the food basket for the Allies. But after the war, things had really changed. And there was a group of business leaders who believed that there were too many farms. We had about 6.8 million at that time. And that having young men coming back from the war and going into farming didn't make sense. These business leaders were interested in having cheap labor in factories because they were industrial laborers or leaders. And so they formed a lobby organization that was pretty effective the first 15 years after the war. And by the time of the Eisenhower administration, they were able to begin chipping away at these policies. Now, in the 1960s, some of these business leaders put together a report with many of our leading universities' economics departments. It was called an adaptive plan for agriculture, and it laid out why farmers were really excess labor, and that really vertical integration was the hope for food in the future, and that chemicals can replace labor and capital can replace labor. And so over the next 30 years, these policies really came to be the public policy of the United States. Now, during the Nixon administration, under the leadership of Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, some of you may remember Earl Butz, he was quite a character. He went around telling farmers they need to get big or get out. They need to plant fence row to fence row, that there was going to be an export economy, and that the only future for farmers was really to grow crops like corn and soy, and to grow them, to buy more land, and to really concentrate on these crops. Now, there was only an export market one time during the 1970s, and that's when Earl Butz got together with some of the grain traders and made a deal with Russia. The grain traders made about $2 billion, and Americans paid more for bread. Now, going into the 1980s, the U.S. had begun to change, and there was a lot of pressure by a number of economic interests to get rid of a lot of the antitrust laws, the laws that prevented companies from becoming monopolies. And some of these companies helped raise the money to elect Ronald Reagan on a deregulatory agenda. And one of the main policies that they wanted to get rid of was really antitrust. So the Reagan administration put into our agencies that oversee antitrust some individuals who went in, cut the budget, got rid of staff, and probably most importantly, really narrowed the definition of what an antitrust violation is. And the United States has never been the same since then. That really began the merger and acquisition frenzy in the food industry and in a lot of other industries that has really changed our country. Now, what Ronald Reagan began, Bill Clinton really finished. Because under the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton really supported an agenda of liberalizing trade rules and getting rid of the last vestiges of those protective rules from the 1930s. So in 1996, just after the U.S. had joined the World Trade Organization and become a party to the North America Free Trade Agreement, what happened is that the Clinton administration helped pass a farm bill called Freedom to Farm. We all know when freedom is added to a piece of federal legislation that we're in trouble, right? This completely deregulated farm policy got rid of all of the supply management and made it possible for a lot of economic interests to make a lot of money from cheap grain, because the price of corn fell by about 50% within the first couple of years. The price of soy dropped by 40%. Now, who really benefited from all of these rules? Well, let's look at some of those companies that we just saw on the trailer. There was, from this merger and acquisition frenzy, a tremendous amount of consolidation in the food industry. And what happens when companies get really, really, really big? Gives them a lot of political power, right? That's probably one of the most dangerous things about monopolies. It's not just the price effect. It's the political power that comes with having just a couple of companies in every type of industry. So we saw the food industry be able to consolidate their power and actually write most of the rules over the past 30 years about food and agribusiness, from how many advertisings your children see about junk food, about 5,000 a year, to the fact that these food companies have been able to use fat, sugar, and salt to addict Americans to processed food. So today, we're left with 20 food processing companies that control more than 60% of the brands in the grocery store. And Americans think that they're going into the grocery store and that there's a lot of choice. But these companies have actually consolidated their power and are doing niche marketing to different segments of the American public. Now, these food processing companies, and the five largest are Pepsi, Nestle, Kraft, Tyson Meat, and the giant meat company JBS, Brazilian-owned, that owns a lot of U.S. brands like, for instance, Swift and Pilgrim's Pride. These companies have a lot of power in our food system, but the grocery retailers have a lot more power. And we have 4 grocery retailers that today control more than 50% of grocery sales, but in many parts of the country, they control 70 to 90% of grocery sales. And I'm talking about Walmart at the top, Kroger, Costco, and Target. And a company like Walmart has figured out how to suck all of the profit out of the food system. Walmart needs tremendous volume, and so the consolidation has followed Walmart all the way down the food chain, even to the farms in the Central Valley of California that must become much larger and must partner with shippers and packers to be able to make a living. Walmart does business in a very special way. Contracts are non-negotiable. Companies, suppliers that do business with them have to do business the way that Walmart wants, even adopting their data systems and their logistics systems, shelving their food items, paying fines if Walmart doesn't like the way that they're doing business. Now, on top of Walmart is the financial services industry, which Fred is going to talk about. But now, I didn't write Foodopoly or really tell this story to discourage people, but I think that we need to actually know how we ended up with this Foodopoly. And it's going to take a lot of political work to change our food system. And I think it starts with changing our democracy, right? Revitalizing our democracy. And we need people to vote with their fork, to vote with their vote, and then to keep the people that we elect accountable. And that means getting involved at the community level and the state level. And I'm really excited by all the political activism that I see on food around this country. So thanks so much for coming, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Winona. Frederick Kaufman is a professor of English and journalism at City University, New York's Graduate School of Journalism. He is a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine with over 100 articles published in magazines including The New Yorker, Harper's, Wired, Foreign Policy, and Nature, and recently had an article in Foreign Policy, How Goldman Sachs Created the Food Crisis. The author of A Short History of the American Stomach. His latest book is Bet the Farm, How Food Stopped Being Food, and he'll be signing that book, Bet the Farm, after the forum up in the foyer upstairs. Ladies and gentlemen, Frederick Kaufman.
So good evening. It's a real honor to be here tonight, and thank you, Ian and Claudia, and it's always a pleasure to be with Winona at these events. I was a food writer for many years, and I wrote a lot of pieces, long-form narrative journalism about competitive eating and about kosher food, and one article that still dogs me is about the Food Network on the frontiers of pornography, gastro-porn. People still ask about that one. And I spent a lot of time doing those articles and a lot of energy, and I was burned out. And I had lunch one day with my editor at Harper's, and I said, Luke, I'm done. I'm done writing about food. And so Luke said, well, that's great, Fred. Now it's time to write about no food. And I had a great deal of trepidation writing about no food and global hunger and the issues here, because this is really one of the great topics of philosophy and economics over the years is why there are so many hungry people on Earth when there actually is, turns out, enough food. So I started looking into why there were so many hungry people, and this was actually quite a good time to start that investigation because it was 2009, it was 4 years ago. And in 2008, something very strange had happened to the world and to the numbers of hungry people, which is that they had been going down for quite some time, and then all of a sudden they spiked up, and we were seeing hundreds of millions of people who had been middle class all of a sudden descending into the ranks of what they call the food insecure and going hungry. And in 2008, for the first time in the history of this planet, we saw almost 1 billion hungry people. And I did not quite understand it, why there were so many hungry people. I thought I'd have to find out. That was my job. I had been given this job. And so I spent some time trying to figure it out. And the first place I looked to see who could feed the world, I thought I'd start with, as Winona points out, one of the Foodopolis. I went and checked out what Domino's Pizza was doing to help solve this problem. And unsurprisingly, I guess in retrospect, I learned that they were not actually so interested in feeding the world, although they kind of said that global pizza was the answer. They were actually interested in money. They were interested in, silly me, they were interested in lining their own pockets. And so I thought, instead of going on that huge, large scale of Domino's, I'd go to the smallest scale possible, and because there are a lot of people I knew who were working on food molecules and trying to genetically engineer foods that would withstand drought and would withstand flood and greater salt in the earth and greater CO2 in the atmosphere and all these real issues of climate change and global warming. And I actually spent quite a lot of time, almost a year, going from one genetic modification laboratory to another across this country. And I met a lot of very interesting people. And I saw a lot of very interesting things in the laboratory. Glow-in-the-dark grapes, all sorts of weird stuff. And once again, though, when all was said and done, what I realized was that although the scientists, many of these scientists really did want to feed the world and make a difference, that they had been co-opted by larger interests who were very focused on patenting their creations and, once again, earning money, earning rent from food. And so I realized that I was 0 for 2. I thought then I would go check out our friends at Walmart, and because there's a great rhetoric out there about sustainability and sustainable foods, and I thought that perhaps the people who are interested in making the most sustainable foods would actually have the key to ending global hunger. But what I realized there again was that what we were looking at here in terms of sustainability was one of the great marketing techniques of the 21st century. It was that sustainability had itself become yet another little commercial plastered on a food, and it actually had nothing to do with sustaining or feeding or anything like that. So then I went to Rome, to the United Nations, and they were very interested in setting up commodity markets in very poor parts of the world, like Guatemala and Tanzania and the Congo and Uganda and Rwanda. And I said, what's a commodity market? And it was kind of hard for them to explain what a commodity market was, but what I realized was that, once again, this commodity market thing that they were setting up, this was about money. It wasn't about food. So I called up a Nobel Prize winner in economics, Amartya Sen, and I explained to him what I just explained to you, that everywhere I had looked for food, I had encountered money. And he basically said, well, of course, Fred, people don't starve because there's not enough food. People starve because they can't afford the food. That the issue in global hunger is not one about food availability or food distribution, it's about the price of food. And in fact, when I looked back and I saw what had happened in 2008, is that the price of global grain had doubled and then doubled again. And that was what had sent hundreds of millions of new people into poverty and into hunger. And what was really frightening was now 2010 was dawning, and the price of global food was actually tipping even higher than it had in 2008. And that's when I did an about face, and I said, okay, forget about food, I'm just going to follow the money. And that's what brought me to Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank and Barclays and Morgan Stanley. And these very large financial powers. I live downtown Manhattan. I'm a soccer dad, and I'd be standing next to the traders, and that's why I dress the way I dress. And I got into some very interesting conversations, and I learned some very interesting things about commodity markets. And I'll tell you one thing, and we can talk about it later. I don't want to talk too much and at too great length at this moment. But I did not understand what a commodity market was. I did not understand what a grain future was. And I talk about this a lot now, and there's always this danger, everybody just kind of glazing over. And it's like, whoa, I don't want to know about it. It's weird. I don't understand money, right? I'll tell you what it is in a nutshell, okay? Food comes out of the ground maybe once or twice a year, right? But we need it every day. That's the problem. And consumers in cities like us, we also need a steady price for the food every day. So when the food comes out of the ground, let's say in September, and all the farmers come to market with their food, the price is going to plummet because there's so much, and you can't even eat that much. And so the farmers lose their shirts, and the price of food goes way down. And then the people who have a lot of money buy a lot for themselves and squirrel it away. And then when the spring comes around and there's no more food, then all of a sudden that price of food goes up and up and up and up and up. And the people who are holding it keep holding it so that the price goes even higher. Commodity markets and food futures and grain futures were actually created to solve that problem. Because the idea is that we should have a steady price of food all year round. And so all these markets are really promises. They're promises about food that's yet to be grown. And they're promises about the price somebody will buy it for and somebody will sell it for. And that's all it is. That's all a food future is a promise for the price I'll sell food or the price I'll buy food in the future. And what they do, these promises going forward, is they regulate the price of food so that we don't have these wild fluctuations, which are the kinds of things that cause revolutions, which we don't want. And what I discovered was that Goldman Sachs had created the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index back in 1991. And it was an investable index in the price of food because they had realized what everybody in this audience really already knows, which is the most valuable thing in the world going forward is food and arable land and fresh water. And they understood that there was a lot of money in it, and so they made it investable. And when this country started falling apart at the seams economically in a financial crisis of 2008, where do you put your money? Well, you don't put your money in mortgage-backed securities, and you don't put your money in the stock market, which is tanking, and you don't put your money in real estate. You don't even put your money in money, because currencies were tanking. But what you put your money in is where the real value is, which is food and farmland and fresh water. And that is why this index went through the roof. Of course, it's a misery index. Every uptick of the index, another woman or child goes hungry. And so that's what I did for the past 4 years, and that's what I did in Bet the Farm, is I followed the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and I followed Wall Street, and I followed the wacky world of food derivatives. And I guess we'll talk more about it, because I think my 15 minutes are up.
Well, listening to you both, I'm thinking that we have to start a new society, a new way of living. We have, for example, the millennial generation, the jobs aren't there. Maybe there is an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. And everybody has a victory garden. Is that, and maybe I'm rushing to a conclusion here, but is this system that you've both described reformable?
Well, I think it's reformable, but it means that we need to involve a lot of people in the politics. And it's really why I wrote Foodopoly, to lay out kind of the systemic problems, because I think a lot of people believe that we can create, for instance, an alternative food system that you are talking about. Farmers markets, CSAs, people grow their own food. And I don't think that's really realistic, especially if you look at the numbers today. The local food market's about $2 billion. Conventional food is $1.2 trillion. And I think that we're going to have to change some of the structures that have brought us to this foodopoly. And I think one of the most important ones is reinstating some kind of antitrust law that's enforced, which seems like far in the future, but we do need to start talking about this, because I think that the consolidation and the concentration that we see in our food system is one of the problems that's endemic in all of the industries in our country, and that it's really at the very center of the problem with our economy, the growing stratification.
But
and
the one thing I would add to that, what Winona is saying is that we've both been traveling a lot and talking about these issues for quite some time, and what I see again and again and again is tremendous excitement about new systems, non-commodity grains, new kinds of distribution systems, and new relationships between the rural and the urban, and all I can say is that actually is the solution. That it is the solution. There is no doubt. The problem is that a lot of the people who are doing this have kind of leapfrogged over a lot of painful steps, which also have to make that solution happen in the large sense as opposed to a smaller sense. That is the way. That is the right way, and that is the right solution, except there has to be reform, political reform, and Wall Street reform, and that reform not only has to be legislated, it has to be enacted, and then it has to be enforced. And we can talk a little bit more about that, because you have to remember, I think, what was that number you just bandied about, 1.2 trillion. Right, well, what I learned is that's bupkis, because the notional value of the global derivatives trade is $648 trillion. Yeah. So there is actual real money here that has to be reformed, and that's going to be a lot harder. That's going to be that's a tough thing to do.
Well, excuse me.
Although there are ways. Yeah.
Well, excuse my naivety, but if the food is killing us, is there a practical way you can boycott? I'm always astounded, for example, that progressives who whine about the Koch brothers don't keep buying brawny paper towels. I mean, is there anything we can do as consumers if the stuff is killing us? Can we boycott it? Or obviously,
look. This was
we'll starve in the process.
This was and I know Winona will back me up here, but this was the great genius of Michael Pollan, who really led the way in so much of this food reform movement, which is that what he did is he said, okay, let's talk about this from the perspective of the affluent consumer. And let's say if I'm an affluent consumer and I'm an intelligent consumer, what then are the choices that I can make to create a movement and right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think he's absolutely right, 100% right, except what he opened the door for was this perception of an even larger problem, of an even deeper problem. And so we're kind of at food movement 2.0 now, or maybe 2.5 hopefully. And so Winona and I, when we talk a lot about politics, we talk about Wall Street reform. We're trying to get a little bit deeper beneath what's driving the system so that it actually can be transformed not just by the affluent consumer choice and affluent consumer awareness, but actually by the nuts and bolts of politics and finance.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that people can do to protect themselves and their families. Don't eat processed food. I mean, Americans spend about 90% of their food budget on processed food at the grocery store and at fast food restaurants. So that's number one. But it's really hard to boycott the food system because even organic food is really controlled by the same set of giant processed food companies. The 14 largest processed food companies own the biggest organic brands. Whole Foods is a company that has used our lack of antitrust enforcement to become the largest and only national distributor of organic food, and in fact sells more than half of their products aren't organic, are just conventional products that you can buy at the grocery store, probably at a cheaper price. And then there is the giant distributor that works with organic or with Whole Foods, which is United Natural Foods, Inc., which has gone public recently, and in the last 12 months, the price of organic products has gone up about 7% nationally because the investors in UNFI want to get some of their investment back. So I think that we need to make a lot of structural changes, and like Fred is talking about, there's a huge and very excited good food movement out there, and we just need people to take the next step, to go beyond their own health and their own community, and to get involved in the politics of food and, in fact, the politics of trying to save our democracy.
Because, I mean, really, if I could add one more thing, which is that, it seems to be a problem, or it seems to be really an act of genius on the Foodopolis part and the Wall Street part, which is that they got a market here which is really inescapable. I mean, we're all in this market for like 2,000 calories a day, right? But you can't escape that. However, that also is kind of a fulcrum of power for the movement, because the fact of the matter is that when this is not, as Bill Clinton famously said, I thought food was like colored television sets, and it's not, right? Food is different. Food is different, and different laws and different policies have to apply to food, right? Because food is not a color television set. Food is part, as Vandana Shiva always points out, the great scholar in India, food and water, it's part of our kind of like ecological context in which life itself emerges. And so this it needs to be perceived separately from the commoditization of everything else in the world. And so that is actually a source of power for reform.
But it seems to me that there are two universes here. I mentioned that people on food stamp and the growing numbers of people on food stamp and what they can afford. And apparently the biggest demographic of most people on food stamps are white, and most are single mothers with kids to feed and with a very, very meager budget. So you have that reality at one end, and then you've got the whole food shopper who's getting ripped off, as you pointed out, and they're doing everything right. But how do you bring these two together?
Well, I think it's why we have to address the problems in our democracy and the growing stratification and this irresponsible behavior that Fred is talking about with the financial services industry and how it's been deregulated over the past 20 years. The failure to enforce even our weak antitrust laws and to let companies get so large that they have so much political power that they can basically use our system of legalized bribery. These are all of the issues that have to be addressed to fix our food system, because cheaper food isn't where we can go. I mean, we need farmers to be able to make a living. We need people to have an income that's adequate that they can buy food. And so that's why we need to address the growing stratification. And that's going to take getting people involved in taking back our democracy.
But Ian, you're pointing to kind of one of the complicated paradoxes of this question, which is that, well, if the price of global food is so high, right, then why is food so cheap? Right? Like why how can McDonald's get away with their price plan? How can Pepsi get away? How can Walmart do what they're doing in terms of food price? So and so this is a complicated idea, but the idea is that on the one hand you have the food industrialists, right, that Winona is talking about, and they're using this kind of Walmart effect to just push down relentlessly the cost of the people who are distributing to them, right? So that there's less and less cost for anybody who's providing them with stuff to sell, okay? And that is what really is screwing the farmer and all these people who are actually producing real food, okay? This relentless downward pressure on the price. At the same time, there's another thing going on, which is there is imaginary food. Instead of Bet the Farm, one of the original titles for my book was virtual food. And the idea is that on the commodity markets and in the financial world, the price of food is based on this imaginary promise of what the food future will be sometime in the future and betting on that price. So you have these two systems which seem to be at odds at the same time. You have financialized food, in which the price of these imaginary food futures are going up, and then you have industrialized food, in which the farmer is being pushed down and down and down. And it's kind of, it's a vicious cycle. And what ends up happening is farmers lose out and middle-class consumers lose out. But it's a two-part question. That's the difficulty of it.
I mean, Walmart has become a lot like the British East India Company, right? It's become the trading arm of the Chinese government. And in food and in any consumer product, right? And that has pushed down, or is one of the reasons that salaries are pushed down, that people don't make a decent living. It's this continual drive to lower prices. And I think that that's one of the problems that we're addressing here tonight, because people also need to make a living, and we shouldn't be driving the price down so far that it actually erodes the quality of food and of products, and that wealth ends up being sucked up right by the traders and those Wall Street giants that are making all of that. What was that, $61 trillion that you were?
648.
$648 trillion. And I think that's why, we need to have a whole set of policies, not just related to food, but if we're going to really reform our system, we're going to have to change a lot of the things around the financial services industry.
Yeah, we need to get the bankers out of the food system. We really do. I mean, if you look at how the Goldman Sachs commodity index works, it doesn't benefit the farmer. It doesn't benefit the consumer. It doesn't even benefit. These are the so-called bona fide hedgers. That's the technical term for the people who are the bakers and the millers and the farmers. It doesn't benefit any of them. In fact, at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, every year now, you have this kind of meeting of strange bedfellows. The head of Pepsi sits down with the head of Coke, with the head of McDonald's, with the head of Burger King, and they all say, we've got a real problem. Problem is financialization. They're screwing up our business model, because McDonald's ain't McDonald's if a Big Mac costs $20, right? That's going to be a big problem for them. And so what you have is this kind of war of the titans at this moment. It's a very interesting moment, and it's actually a moment, I think, conceivably a moment of vulnerability. And so I think that's why it's a good moment to push for reform.
So we've got, of course, reform and an alternative model are not mutually exclusive. We should move forward on both of these fronts. But my modest efforts to move forward to grow tomatoes, which probably cost about $100 a piece, and this year, because of the June gloom going through August, they're pretty paltry. So I'm at a loss. Are there ways that we can? I see communal gardens. That's a great idea. Are there ways to build upon that? Do you have? You're a family farmer. Give us a sense of how practical it is for people who decide to take this alternative path.
Well, I think it's going to be hard for Fred in Manhattan to grow all of the food that he needs to eat. I mean, I think that's why, it's wonderful. Those people who can grow their own food or who can go to a farmer's market, this is a real benefit for those individuals. But I don't think that this is the way that we're going to feed our population in the long term. We're a post-industrial society. We need to change the rules so that everybody has an adequate income to be able to access healthy food. And I think that's part of having a real society, right, and having a real democracy. And so I think it all goes back to politics. And I think that a lot of people around the country are really mad about what's going on. I know, having traveled around with a book, people always come and they say, what can we do? And, it's one of the reasons that I run a public interest group called Food and Water Watch, and I would urge anybody who's interested in these issues to go to our website at Food and Water Watch. There are a lot of ways that people can get involved locally in these issues and nationally, because really, in the long run, that's what it's going to take.
Obviously, the answer is not for all of us to grow our own tomatoes. It's that, and in fact, that hasn't been the answer since maybe 10,000 years ago. The whole point of civilization, if we remember our 7th grade social studies, is about cities. And the problem with people who live in cities is they actually need to get their food from someplace else. That's the whole point of civilization. That's where the priests and the engineers and all these guys are in cities, right? And so one of the big problems forever has been stabilizing the price of food and good relations between rural and urban. So, it's almost a red herring that you're hanging there, Ian. But I think what you're doing, though, is opening the door to more specific language on our part. So, for instance, what am I talking about when we talk about Wall Street reform? Well, there actually was Wall Street reform. It was called the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act and was passed by Congress. It was passed by Congress, okay? It's a huge, monstrous piece of legislation. Everybody agrees, fairly crappy piece of legislation. Big, monstrous book, right? However, it calls for what are called position limits for Wall Street banks, for bankers in the food business. In other words, what it basically says, the law says, okay, if you are not a baker, if you're not a farmer, if you're not a bona fide hedger in the food system, you cannot go all in with trillions of dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars into the commodities markets, because you're skewing it, you're subverting it, you're transforming it from a risk management tool into a risk creation tool, okay? Very simple. It's a very simple part of the law, okay? That's a great thing. It was passed by Congress. It was signed by the President of the United States. Then came the lawsuit, right? So the lawsuit is the lead lawyer for the lawsuit, a guy named Gene Scalia. Okay, got the picture, right? And so he represents a very large lobbying organization for international derivatives. And they sued the CFTC, which is actually the law enforcement agency for a law like this, and they won their lawsuit. And so what you have here is a situation where you have a law passed by Congress, signed by the president, given to the enforcement agency, sued. So there are no position limits. There used to be position limits under under FDR in 1934 Agriculture Act. There were position limits. It's what Winona was talking earlier about the 80s and this kind of mania for deregulation, which is that these position limits generally kind of faded through the 80s and the 90s, right? So why can't we have them? Why aren't we demanding them? They were the law.
Let's take some questions from the audience here. We have microphones on both sides, and somebody's already grabbed the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just wondering, the paradox of Walmart driving the price down, but the comment made that, in fact, there's enough food, it's just too expensive. So my question would be, if you could wave a wand and Walmart went out of business tomorrow, what would happen to the price of food in this country? Would you want to see that happen?
I'll take an early.
Yeah.
Well, one of the, I think, answers to that question when we talk about the price of food is how do people in the developing world eat? Because I think that's a lot of what Fred is getting at. It's people who make $1 or $2 a day. Many of them, about 2 billion of them, are farmers or peasant farmers and are being pushed into the dollar economy. So part of what we might want to do to feed those people is to allow them to stay on the land and to feed themselves as they have been for thousands of years, rather than allowing some of our international finance institutions to work with national governments to begin to try to, modernize life for these peasant farmers. So I think that's a different issue than Walmart in the United States. Now, it turns out that the price of food actually is going up, has begun to go up over the past the past decade, about 3% a year. And so I would say that there is a lot of cheap food to access, but anyone who goes to the grocery store and buys a healthy diet knows that food is getting more expensive, and that actually, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Standards, their statistics are a little bit different than the USDA, who always talks about cheap food. They say that the bottom 40% of Americans spend about 35% of their income on food. So, this is a more complex question. I think that what we need to do is to establish some antitrust laws. We need to even have Congress do a look back to see what the effect has been on the consolidation, Walmart, and a lot of other industries, and then to figure out how we can begin breaking up some of these companies so that we have a more equal distribution of opportunities for small businesses and for other companies. So I think what you're doing is kind of simplifying the question.
But also, no, but I think it's a good question. I think it's a very good question. So we don't want to forget that there actually is hunger in this country, right? We have almost 50 million people on food stamps in this country. However, as Winona rightly points out, the massive hunger in the world, the hundreds of millions of people are not in this country. They're in other parts. They're in other parts of the world, right? And they are not Walmart consumers. They generally are not Walmart consumers. And so when we buy at Walmart, right? When we buy, let's say, a box of Cheerios at Walmart, how much of that, like $2 that we're spending on a box of Cheerios, goes to the actual grain, right, in the Cheerios? Not very much. It actually is going, right, precisely. It mostly, that money is going to advertising and labeling and distribution and all this stuff, right? Whereas in the parts of the world where people really are starving on a much more massive level, they're buying much more close to the source of the grain. They're actually going to be buying the wheat or the sorghum or or whatever it is, and often a commoditized grain. So if Walmart were to disappear tomorrow, I don't know if that would really solve the problem that I'm looking at, which is the problem of speculation in global grain markets. You see what I'm saying?
What about for the American consumer? He's making the point that since it's one of the cheapest places to buy food, if you take them away, don't they keep the price of food down domestically?
I think Walmart. Well, Winona, do you want to try this one?
Well, 1 out of 3 grocery dollars goes to Walmart, and the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans. So if Walmart went away, I think we'd see a little bit of a redistribution of wealth. So,
I get it. Right. Let's take another question.
Hello there. 3 words I haven't heard tonight yet is food and water sovereignty. And so can you talk about how the major players are corralling the water in order to monopolize the food?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I had a lovely Thanksgiving this year. I was in Ethiopia, and I was there for Harper's Magazine, and I'm there because I was very focused on Nile water and what's going on with the water there, and it's a very interesting situation because I'm following a story about an Arab sheikh who's actually is involved in a massive water grab, and this is a monstrous problem, across the world, which is that what's happening is that you're seeing people with money, understanding, as I said before, what we all know, what is valuable, food, fresh water, and then going into countries, mostly in Central Africa and the Horn of Africa, leasing land at absurdly low rates for absurdly long amounts of time, and getting the water and going in there and starting industrial agriculture, right? And so I think that a lot of the problems that we're talking about, right, it's no longer just this country, right? In other words, this country has its own very deep set of problems. However, we're seeing even worse problems in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in certain parts of Asia, in certain parts of Latin America. Those problems are actually much harder to legislate out of existence, right? Because it's very hard to tell the Ethiopian government, how to lease or not to lease their land and their water rights. But it's a monstrous problem, and it needs a lot more attention.
I think one of the things that's so exciting around the world is that there is a farmers movement called Via Campesina. Many of you are probably familiar with Via Campesina. The U.S. affiliate is the National Family Farm Coalition. And these are peasant farm groups from all around the world working together as a coalition to try to reform many of these policies. And one of the main things being worked on today is to attempt to stop the newest round of trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership being one of them, an agreement that would be with Asian nations, but is really a to go around the stall at the World Trade Organization and to have a new vehicle for the next round of trade liberalization, which will have an enormous effect on food and agriculture policy and water. And Via Campesina is vehemently opposed to these. There are a couple of trade agreements being negotiated, and they're working with their governments to try to stop the U.S. and other nations from moving forward with this. So I think, the message is we shouldn't give up hope because people really are fighting to be able to feed themselves.
Well, my question was already almost brought up with the food sovereignty thing, but I just want to say I was in Brazil June 2012 at the Rio Plus 20 conference where I marched with La Via Campesina. And I remember asking a guy who spoke English, where are we heading? It was at night and we were surrounded by Brazilian riot police. So he says, we're going to get the capitalists. So, we really have to the reforms should lead to something even much further to change our system and create a new civilization, a new type of world. So anyhow, I'll never forget marching with the landless peasant movement in La Via Campesina. So it's ongoing.
All right.
First of all, thank you both for getting this information out and spreading the word. I'd like to hear what you both think about the theory of people, especially in Western countries, if they became vegan or vegetarian, how that drop in animal protein would lead to freeing up more corn, soy, and wheat for other people in this country and other countries.
Well, look, I remember in 2008, I went to Rome for the Food and Agriculture Organization once every 5-year meeting. And there were like 100 heads of state there, and everybody gives their 5-minute hunger speech, some a lot longer. And it was a 3-day conference, and the world press was there, and Bill Gates was there, oh my Lord. And when it was all over, I asked a lobbyist who had been helping me out if she'd like to go to dinner to celebrate the fact that it was over. And we went to a restaurant, and we sat down, and I ordered myself a big, fat, juicy steak. And it came and just sat in front of me, and I just looked at it, and she looked at it, and that was the last steak I've ordered. That's all I can tell you. So I don't know. Maybe somebody wiser than I can tell you, but in terms of the way I eat, I certainly believe that.
I think it makes a really big difference for your health. But, I think if we really wanted to deal with the grain issue, we would reinstitute some of those policies that I mentioned that are really common sense, like a grain reserve. The processed food industry and the grain traders don't want a grain reserve, even though China's had one since, I think it's 62
54.
AD. 54 AD. Yeah. So, that it would help stabilize prices. That would mean that during dry years that there would be a reserve of grain that traditionally here in the U.S. was stored on in the silos on farmers' farms.
I've never heard anybody argue that we should not have a national strategic petroleum reserve.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody ever argues that. We had a national strategic grain reserve, and it was actually a farmer-owned grain reserve, so it's like no communism or anything like that, right? The farmers kept ownership of their own grain, and the person who finally killed it was Bill Clinton. Unfortunately, he thought they were color TVs again.
So those are the things that we really need to go back to. There are some common sense things that would really help stabilize prices, and we could actually do that as part of the Farm Bill. We all know the Farm Bill this time around is a debacle, but the exciting news is at least people know there is a Farm Bill now, so maybe in a few years we'll have built enough political power to actually do something with it.
I'm just curious, you had talked about the Battle of the Titans before. As we speak, there's like water tables all over this country being destroyed and farmland being destroyed every day with this fracking situation. I'm curious where this fits into the whole dynamic you're talking about. If we could talk about that for a minute.
Well, I'll just say something. I know Winona has quite a bit to say about this, so I'll try and get my own 2 cents in, which is that, this whole idea of water scarcity has led to this notion of, well, what we need to do is then price water. If we can price water and financialize water, then what will happen is that people won't waste it so much because they will spend too much on it. I think that is really the wrong approach. I think that financialized food has been the wrong approach, and I think financialized water has been the wrong approach, because every time ExxonMobil will outbid the small farmer for that water, every single time. And so yes, this is a huge problem in terms of financialization across the board. And once again, I think we have to just kind of stick to our guns. We have to say food and water is different. We have to treat them different than other widgets in our economy.
Well, the economic policies over the last 30 years have devastated many rural places in this country and urban places too. And one of the remedies that's being promoted is extraction. And so fracking, which is a new type of natural gas extraction that uses millions of gallons of water and high pressure with lots of dangerous chemicals, is being used in a lot of the places where we grow food around this country. And I think it's the antithesis of what we really want to see. And fracking is really too dangerous to pursue. We know a lot about the horrible effects. Fracking is even going on here in LA in the city limits, which is pretty unbelievable because of the air pollution associated with fracking. And I think that, we really need to ban fracking, and there's a growing movement around the country to ban fracking.
And if you notice that, once again, is what Winona is pointing out, which is if you look at the political pressure in New York State, where I live, right, Governor Cuomo has yet to sign a bill legalizing fracking, and that's because he's scared shitless. Right? And that's because of simply straightforward political pressure on him. And that is really making the difference.
More than 200 organizations in New York are bird dogging Governor Cuomo around the state, and he can't even go on vacation without people showing up with signs and saying no fracking. And for the first time, public opinion has now turned so that more people are against fracking in New York than are for it. And we're going to have that happen here in California, right?
Thanks. As I listened to the guests tonight, the solutions seem pretty straightforward, and they all seem to be common sense, yet they're not happening. Winona says, we need a real society and a real democracy. But when in human history have we had that? And the moderator asked the question, is the system reformable? Really the question is society reformable? It all comes down to, are we going to share the resources in a more equitable manner? And that's not happening. And so where are the incentives? Where's the practical way to get to the change? We can all describe the problem, but where are the incentives? How are we going to make it happen? That's my question.
Well, you're all here tonight. You're here for a reason. This stuff simply comes from hope and idealism and focus and organization. It's not so impossible. I really see a lot of activism out there. I really do, and I see a lot of pressure on both sides. I see a lot of people very angry about Wall Street. I see it in the front page of the New York Times. I get calls from reporters in the New York Times who I feed the stories to. This sort of thing it's not going away. That's right. Look at Winona. That Winona is, how many days straight have you been on the road now? 8 months.
Yeah. I think we have to have the long view of history, because it took more than 50 years of organizing to get Social Security, the 8-hour workday. You know, we win some, then we kind of move backwards. And what I see in having spent the last 8 months traveling around is a lot of people wanting to get politically involved again. I mean, why do we have such a dysfunctional Congress? Because in a lot of states, we've sent lunatics to Congress. No, and I'm not kidding, because of the gerrymandering that's taken place, because there hasn't been enough attention to politics in states, and people come to politics via issues. We need to make the connection between the issues, and we need to get people involved in the nuts and bolts of literally taking back our democracy. And I know at Food and Water Watch, we've gotten involved with the Democracy Initiative, which is a coalition of lots of groups, labor, environmental groups, consumer groups, that are fighting for campaign finance reform, to reform some of the Senate rules that prevent a real democratic process from happening, and that are looking to reform the things happening around voting, a lot of the draconian things that are preventing people from getting to the polls and actually being able to vote, which is, of course, a right for citizens in this country.
Look, I think I once had a conversation with a very high-ranking official who insisted on anonymity at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And I was talking to him about the issues in global hunger, and he said to me, "You know, Fred," he said, "hungry people aren't angry people." And I felt like saying, "Fuck you, man. That's because they're too hungry." They're too hungry to be angry, right? The people who are angry are middle-class people, right? The people who actually have enough time and leisure to understand what's going on. It's really, this is our battle. I mean, this is for us to do.
Yeah.
Well, I think we more or less have time for one more question. The lady up there with the, yes. Wait for the microphone.
Wait for the microphone.
You're on television.
That's why I'm
Candid
cursing,
camera.
because I'm on TV.
So I have a question that has to do with, I haven't heard anything about education. And I wonder if either of your books address the fact that none of this political action will be possible unless we start educating kids at a really young age to not want those things that are sold with sugar in them or McDonald's, and to educate their parents, who may be very uneducated themselves, on their food stamps or on their limited incomes, that it's possible to eat a healthy diet and use foods that are not so programmed by McDonald's and these corporations.
I mean, let me just make one quick comment about that, which is that, so I'm an academic, I'm a professor, and what I see over the past really 15 years is this extraordinary growth in food studies and in food curricula, and you know, I think these books sell well at the university level, and sometimes at the high school level. And so actually, I agree with you 100%, which is that it's all about education, and it's happening. It's just not. It's just, once again, as Winona points out, it's not immediate. It takes time. There are films out there, right? We all know what they are. This is a long process. But yeah, it's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see it all around the country as I've been traveling with Foodopoly, lots of local initiatives to educate people about food, and I think that's a really important thing. And I think we also have to educate those young people about their involvement in political affairs, because we don't just want to educate about food, we want to educate people about becoming citizens and how important that is to the future of our democracy.
And there are a lot of educational programs, like Food Corps is out there.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are very focused specifically on those issues. You know, Pollen's new book, Cooked, and Marion Nessel is always out there. You know, fighting that fight. There are a lot. There are just Raj. I'm going to see him in a couple of months. Raj Patel. He'll be in New York, and we are all out there all the time, doing that work.
Well, both of your current works are available for signing up in the foyer. We're going to end it now. We thank both of you for joining. And anybody who wants to continue the conversation can do so up in the foyer.
Thank you.